So we're here today with two wonderful people. We have Suneil Sanzgiri, who is the director and producer of Letter from Your Far Off Country, a film that we've just screened that has been playing at the Indian Film Festival of Los Angeles, whose senior programmer Ritesh Mehta is here. And we're going to be having a short Q&A talking about the film's themes and intervention into the current political climate and Indian experimental cinema. So, my first question, I think, when I watched the film, I was incredibly moved by it. First of all, even the fact that it's a short film, but I think what really affected me was its sort of mixture of forms. So it's shot on this old film, 16 millimeter film from 2002, if I'm not mistaken. And it sort of mixes temporalities in its form because it's using like very current softwares like 3D mapping and iMessaging. And then it's got very old footage on this old film. And I think what really moved me was that intertextuality of it, that mixture of forms that literally move between temporalities from the past, present, future. And I think that to me, being of this generation, it was hard hitting because I think that's how we consume information now. It's how we sort of process political events. It's how we process history and the way it filters into the present that we're living in. And so I kind of wanted to, that's a pretty open-ended intro, but I kind of wanted to ask about that because that was the most striking thing for me to see in the film is that how, like, what were your thoughts on the form? I think, Sunil, like when you were making the film, what was that process like for you, the construction process? And then Ritesh, how did you sort of receive that and process that as a viewer?
Yeah, so I think you really, I mean, that was a brilliant description. Thank you so much. And I think that you're exactly right that a lot of what I was getting at with the interplay between the kind of digital technologies and the analog or the, quote unquote, archival footage is that this is primarily how, as someone who did not grow up in the homeland, did not grow up in India, but has been yearning for questions of identity and diaspora and longing and belonging, I like to say, that this is exactly how I personally, and I think a lot of others, connect and receive information exactly like you said. To kind of watch the events such as the attack at the Jamia Millia Islamia University in 2019 from afar, and then to go back to for my first time to go to India a week after an entire Muslim neighborhood was burnt to the ground in Delhi. I mean, these were like there was such a disconnect from what you saw and what you experienced in very different ways. To see the Shaheen Bagh movement in person was probably one of the most moving experiences of my life. I like to say how when I went to Shaheen Bagh, there was this unbelievable like interconnection and solidarity, not only between the Kashmiri struggle for freedom, Azadi, as well as the continued persecution of Muslims and Dalits, but also to questions of liberation here in the United States for Black people, because we had books by Malcolm X, we had books by Angela Davis right next to Arundhati Roy, right next to Ambedkar. And, a lot of these Malcolm X books or Angela Davis books would be translated into multiple language, and they had a people's library there at Shaheen Bagh. And so of all places you wouldn't necessarily expect to see it, but it made total sense. And it really grew to this question of the interconnectedness of struggle, of global struggle for freedom. And I think a lot of these things, as I was looking to the past, I was looking to these figures, and a lot of these figures such as specifically not just Ambedkar, but Aga Shahid Ali, but also Safdar Hashmi. So a lot of these figures play out because of I hear their not just their names, but their voices or their some connection to them at a lot of protests here in the United States, at the Indian consulate also as well, in India as well. But you would hear chants of Hala Bol, right? Raise your voice. And I was kind of like, what is that? You know, where does that come from? And it came from this Safdar Hashmi play, Hala Bol. And so it led me to a lot of these questions, you know, and so you would hear the Faz Ahmed Faz, you know, song that Iqbal Bano then, you know, famously sang in 1986. And you would hear people singing these songs at these protests and at these rallies. And so a lot of these references are essentially like a love letter. You know, there's many different kinds of letters and modes of address to the film, not only from me to Prabhakar Sanzgiri, but and also Agash Shahid Ali to, you know, himself essentially. But also, for me, this film is also a love letter to the movement, a movement that is still ongoing despite there's many movements now. There's the farmers' protest, of course, but there's still significant resistance to the CAA, and yeah, just a love letter to the movements for freedom and resistance of the diaspora. That's how I like to think of it.
When I saw this film for the first time, we've been like watching a lot of films for the Indian Film Festival, which just concluded 2 days ago from this recording. But I started watching films in January, and I first, like Slamdance Film Festival in January, or maybe it was February, that was available, and like I had friends who programmed there, so I just began watching films there, and I just saw this film called Letter from Your Far Off Country. I hadn't heard of it before. I just clicked play, and I don't know, it was 5 p.m. and I was just like, I remember like all the distraction and noise of the day just kind of quietened down, and I was completely sucked into the film and immensely moved. I've watched the film like 9 times since then. Like I think my 9th time was this morning, and every time I see something new, like there's so much encoded into the text, and there's plethoras to decode. I mean, I used in my program note for IFFLA, I used Bakhtin's term heteroglossia of voices and resistance that is really encoded through these amazing digital interventions. When, all the programmers at IFFLA, when we were discussing the film on multiple occasions, like we were all immensely moved. I remember actually it being like the first time, like, to talk amongst like-minded people about a film that otherwise people in your family, people far away, whose political affiliations are increasingly known to you as violently different from yours, to discuss this film with the programmers at IFFLA who are like-minded and who all responded similarly in a time where there was so much strife going on. This felt like a beautiful cocoon of an experience. I think there were a couple of moments for the first time in my time as a programmer where, while talking about it, I was like I had to kind of fight tears, because it was just like talking about all the stuff that moves you in this film. It makes you realize, for me, the encounter with the film was about my identity as a member of the diaspora. I never thought of myself as a member of the diaspora until recently. I grew up in Mumbai, and for the longest time, I thought of myself as an Indian citizen. But now it's been 15 years since I've been in the US consecutively, and there's been so much protest happening this decade and this past decade that has shaped myself as a political subject. So for me, this film just really allowed me to, like when Suneil asks his father to read the letter that he wrote to their relative, for me, that kind of distanciation and distance and mediation of one's identity, that's what really touched me the most. And the last thing I'll say is that talking about memory and biography and identity, which are some of the themes in this film. When the protester or the student at Jamia Millia Islamia University first utters the word "Dear Shahid," which comes right after the intertitle in the film, in the first minute of the film. I felt like a thud inside my chest, because I felt that reminded me of my own theater days in Mumbai at Prithvi Theatre, where somehow our idealism was removed from the political um, marginalizations that already were occurring in the world. And I don't know, that use of voice, I felt that I knew this person, and I felt that I should have been there at that die-in protest.
Mm. It's interesting that you bring that up, because my own experience of the film was very much colored by the fact that I've always been diaspora. I've been to India many times, but there's always been a removal just by sheer distance and then experience growing up elsewhere from like the historical arc of what is happening in your homeland, the place you're a citizen of. And I think that was also what really moved me. I think the epistolary format that you were discussing, like the sense of voice, you feel it's addressed to you and you are also simultaneously addressing someone else. And it's like a really striking sort of like multiple temporalities at once that you're trying to work through. I think the political matters, it sort of brings me to the next question, that there's a lot of, obviously there's a political aspect to this film, and we know what is happening in India right now and the current political climate that we're living in sort of globally as well. I was wondering, how do you see this film as an intervention into how we can talk about Indian politics, especially as diaspora? Yeah.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's no one way to talk about it, right? But I think that for me, it's a series of questions. I mean, there's a few matters. Like sometimes I like being really direct, and especially sometimes when I'm like not afraid. I mean, I have that privilege of being able to speak out here in the United States, versus I think of people who are completely silenced back in India, voices, people who get picked up off the street and are never heard from again, or like Professor Hani Babu, who is was imprisoned, and many people who speak out against the ongoing atrocities from the BJP, and especially now that COVID has devastated. So there's a time to be direct, and there's a time to speak nearby, as Trinity Minha, the filmmaker and writer, says. And I think that art has that place, art and film, and it allows us the removal and the space to find other ways of speaking to things that otherwise are completely unspeakable. I think that even when we're screaming from the mountaintop about something direct, we can scream Azadi, we can scream all these things, but our voices get lost. Our voices get lost because those in power are going to do everything they can to stop those voices from being heard. So when we scream freedom, when we scream liberation, who is actually listening? And so when we have art as a space to think through these bigger questions and take time to go back in history to look at and learn from the struggles of our ancestors, the struggles of people who fought before us, it gives us space. It's a unique place for reflection. I don't think art is ever going to I don't necessarily think that art is going to be the thing that changes the world necessarily. Like, I don't think it ever really sparks people to action as much as some people like to think it does. But it's a place for reflection, and it's a place to find other ways of talking about things that are just so incomprehensible and so big. When we think of the COVID crisis in India, our brains can't wrap around the numbers that we know and the toll that has taken on every single family in the diaspora. So I do think that places like film and spaces like this are moments to feel the things that we don't necessarily know how to feel in relationship to violence and destruction.
Mm. Ritesh, how about you? I mean, I think you could maybe even bring in like what were your discussions that were happening when you sort of added this film to the lineup? Um, what sort of discussion did you hope it would spark, perhaps?
I think for us it was like, for me it was like, we need this film, right? Like stat in our lineup. It's also difficult for. It's a challenge. I was telling Suneil in our Q&A for IFFLA that this is a challenging film for IFFLA audiences that are used to a more standardized narrative. This is an experimental film with aspects of documentary, but I think the kind of discussion that we were having is about, we kind of got into the philosophical aspects of the film, and I guess this is a question for Sunil in turn, is that um, you say the diaspora, like the film talks about diaspora as always changing, as almost like as a moving target. And if we're encountering these material letters and other aspect and other texts and voices every day, and on a piecemeal basis, what hope is there of like pinning down or coming to terms with our present with regard to our history? You know, like, although diaspora is always moving and changing, how do we settle accounts and carry on with our daily lives um, if you know, like, if the people that are being marginalized are constantly, that's always happening, that's unfolding always, and that affects us, but somehow we're also far off from it. And in your film, you kind of take these interventions through these mediated readings to kind of put a pin on it, as one would put a pin on a Google map. But how does one do that for all of us in the diaspora, that where everything's just changing? How do we pin our identity?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, our identities are never pinned, but what does it mean to kind of what does it mean to have it, I mean, for one, documented, for one, kind of fixed temporally within a work, Um, and I think that, I mean, I definitely can't answer
No,
your question.
it was just a rant that came
Sure,
about.
no,
Like, I feel completely. It's just, it was my response. Like, I felt unspooled by it in a good way.
yeah. That, I mean, I would encourage that unspooling, just because, I mean, at the very end of the film, there's this last kind of question or statement, and it says, "How we comprehend, how we connect is up to us." For me, that is a call towards any viewer, whether or not you're South Asian or, you know, any other identity, any combination of identity you might want to dream up. The onus is on the viewer to then find ways of connecting not only to the story that I've kind of threaded, the kind of, nebulous, rhizomatic assemblage, um, to find your way of connecting to that narrative of resistance and liberation and, abolition, but also find it in your own, where you are currently, find it in your own people, find your people. Who are your people? Find your people. It doesn't, I mean, it might not be clear. It doesn't have to be related to an identity or a nationality, but find your people. A lot of the work of this project, which is now 3 films long, I just finished the 3rd film. A lot of this work was an attempt to connect, right? This was an attempt to precisely have conversations like this, which I'm very, very thankful for. This was why I make my work, is to meet other people in my diaspora that I have felt removed from, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I think that there's a lot of within the kind of especially American context, the question of assimilation has one that has plagued not only the South Asian community but the Pan Asian community broadly. And I think right now there is a definite turn to this question of solidarity amongst each other, which gets tricky very quick because it's messy. Sorry, my email went up. Solidarity is extremely messy, and diaspora is messy. Identity is messy, and you have to sit in that messiness. You have to exist within it, and you have to work within that messiness because nothing is ever clear. There's no guide. But solidarity, as my friend Deepa Iyer likes to say, solidarity is a verb. It's an action. You have to take action. You have to, that might not be protest, that might not be whatever, but you have to take action. You can't sit back, and you have to connect. You have to find ways of connecting. Art and film is my way of connecting. And I've been extremely enriched and very fortunate to meet some incredible people along the way and have some amazing discussions, people that I hope to stay in contact with for the rest of my life. So that's what I have to say about identity and diaspora as a moving target. It's a messy, messy place, a messy, wonderful, beautiful, tragic, heartbreaking place, but a place nonetheless that is full of opportunity for mobilization, whether or not that's on the street or whether or not that's just being mobilized to meet other people and work with other people and give yourself opportunities to talk about these messy realities.
It's interesting that you talked about connecting because it connects very well to my last question. When I was watching this film, I think I experienced like unexpected grief, and grief that was not mine, but also mine because of who I am, because I'm part of the diaspora. And obviously right now we're experiencing a lot of collective grief, obviously, because of the COVID crisis, because of this 1-year pandemic, and because we know that things could have been better if we were taken care of better by our state or by, the structures that we live under. And one of the things I wanted to ask about was, how do you think this film is a way to also feel grief collectively? And I ask like this, it's interesting because Suneil, you made the film and it has a personal element for you. And I imagine that was its own personal journey. And then you put it out and then everyone has their own personal journey. How can we process this sort of like chain of like coming to terms with the traumas and violences that are depicted in a beautiful way, but that have these emotional reactions within a very hard reality that we're living in? Because we talked about solidarity, but solidarity is tiring as well. I think that's important to note. And you can be too tired to wake up and do the work because it's hard. And I think a lot about Claudia Rankine, who's a fantastic Jamaican American poet, and her book, Don't Let Me Be Lonely. And it's basically like this rousing call for like the main thing that we suffer as a society. And I know she was talking more, the American society is that we are so, even before this pandemic, we are isolated. And that's because of these new technologies that we have. And how do we move forward with art, especially in this difficult time, to actually allow ourselves to mourn and grieve and feel grief together, and then have that strength to actually enact the solidarity we want to? I don't know if that makes sense. Long-winded question, but yeah, I was interested in that.
No, that's beautiful. And thank you for bringing in Claudia Rankine. I love her writing too. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, grief and grievance, that's actually the title of a show. But there's actually a title of an exhibition up at the New Museum called Grief and Grievance, but it came to mind immediately. But this question of what is collective, what is the individual versus the collective response to grief? And you're exactly right. There are times where you can't wake up, and that's absolutely okay. I don't really have any specific answers to this. This was the form of me, of my grievance too. And the form that took was trying, not only trying to comprehend, but trying to go back and understand, which is impossible. There's no true understanding of this collective form of violence. But that there's one pathway forward, which is being in communion, and if that is grieving with others. Some people aren't afforded that opportunity. Some people aren't afforded the opportunity to be with other people, specifically within their own, diaspora community. I can speak to one thing that I'm working on right now, that is a new collective called SAID, South Asian Artists in Diaspora, that a number of us got together, and sparked by actually the person who did part of the soundtrack for this film, Mehta, who I've worked with on all three of my films. She's an amazing activist and writer and musician. But her call for action was just like, what are we going to do here in the US? Like, what can we do? And we got together and we were like, well, we're all artists, let's organize something. And so now we're in the works of putting on a really wonderful benefit concert that is going to take the form of music and poetry and comedy and political roundtables and online events with some great names. Specifically about South Asian people in the diaspora. And we wanted to create a space in person to be politically mobilized, but also to kind of heal and mourn, because we haven't been given that opportunity for ourselves, specifically because our diaspora is so huge. Like, how do we give ourselves that specific space? And to be quite honest, in spaces of pan-Asian spaces of grievance, like after the Atlanta shooting, a lot of questions were like, how do we understand this? How do we understand both our inclusion and exclusion as this question of Asian, because a lot of people don't, who migrate here from India or wherever else, don't necessarily think of themselves as Asian. So, that question becomes important. But also, like, so we were like, well, let's maybe think of a space for ourselves, like let's find a space that's specific to what's going on with the massive death toll that's coming out of India and across South Asia. It's not limited to India, right? Mm. So these are some things that I'm thinking about like, how do we process? How do we grieve? Do we grieve together? Do we grieve individually? Do we do everything? I mean, there's no right or wrong way. And we each will have our own experience with that. Political action and mobilization is one way, but it's also the odds are insurmountable. Although we have seen some headway to be, with BJP's losses, most recent losses, which is potentially, sign of hope, maybe. Yeah, that's all I have to say really right now. I would love to hear Ritesh's response too, actually.
Go for it.
My response to how do we deal with grief in this time, I feel like personally for me, I'm motivated by, even though my day-to-day work in the media industries and in Hollywood feels sometimes far off from allowing myself as much time as I would want with dealing with or with understanding my response to the political upheavals and that seem to be constant. Like, if anything, this film reminds me that, like, it's not just today; it's always been there, and we just haven't been, we haven't had access to it, and that's because of silencing and things being written off by the entities in power in the past. I still believe and have faith in the encounter, and for me, the encounter is cinema. I feel like everything for me, like my understanding about the world is mediated through cinema, and I feel extremely privileged in being able to watch films for IFFLA, for Outfest, for other festivals that I do, because I feel like I make sense for me, the encounter is between texts and the interstices between texts, and I'm waiting to find a film that I can, read alongside Suneil's film, because I think what Suneil, what you've done in this film has you've kind of raised the bar for mediation with another cinematic text. And I'm sure there are, and I'm going to be very interested in finding out which films will be companion pieces to your films, because for me that's my way of forgetting, which sometimes I want to, and also in that forgetting I'm able to just be in this cavern of cinema and just be able to kind of almost have films like in front of me talking to each other in my own head. But that for me is my cinematic anthropological encounter, and that's how, even though it's a very intellectual action and process, and that in a way is not great for engaging with the realities of the world, that's my first step.
Thank you. We're already over time, so I'm gonna have to stop this, even though it's such an interesting conversation. I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time.